All right, how are people doing? We're almost to the end of week 9. That's kind of scary. So the end is coming for this class, but it's really only the halfway point, which is it's worth considering. Yeah.
So just to clarify, you said that we're doing the final on Friday of the week before finals, like
next Friday.
And during finals week, it's just working.
Just the harmony paper. Yeah. So we won't meet during our typical finals period. I think I am technically supposed to be doing something with that period. Work on your paper.
Yeah. I'm gonna work on your paper.
Yeah. No, I don't plan to make use of finals week and our finals period for that, but I do want there to be something due over finals, which I think is good enough. So yeah, we will have our last exam. I made sure to post the exams earlier today, but I realized that I had accidentally copied and then entered grades in the copied mistake that I'd made last year. So I don't know if you all saw the weird point distribution between exam 1 and exam 2, and it came from the fact that exam 1 was a graded quiz and not an assignment. If you make a graded quiz, there's no way to assign a maximum number of points. You have to make the questions in Canvas, which I have never done. So there was no way to make it worth 100 points. So rather than re-enter everyone's grades, I just made it worth 0 points, made exam 2 worth 200 points, and now you have your exam 1 out of 0 and exam 2 out of 200. So it is the equivalent of exam 1 out of 100 and exam 2 out of 100, since they're equally weighted. So don't pay attention to your percentage grade on exam 2, because there are twice as many points possible. So you should double your exam 2 percentage if you care about your actual exam 2 percentage. So I apologize for the confusion surrounding that, but that was an adequate solution from my perspective. Feel free to disagree and make me do more work, though.
I want you to be your best mood.
It shouldn't have anything to do with anything. If my grades are based on my mood, there's something horribly wrong here.
Subconscious.
That's true. I should also know better than to assume that I have no bias. I strive to minimize my biases. All right, I want to talk just a little bit about what to expect with the transition between this quarter and next quarter, just to start priming you and preparing you for that. I guess how many people in here are taking next quarter's class? Just about everybody. Woohoo. So yeah, we're moving from theory to application. We've done a lot of talking about games in class without doing much. All of the doing has been over homework. So hitting the ground running next quarter, we're going to be starting to make games in groups. And it'll feel a lot better to be actively putting something together that will become a project. So really consider these 2 courses as, this isn't the end of the course, this is the end of the theory part of the course, and trying to separate them between the theory and the application. Yeah.
So what are our class time next quarter? We're still going to be discussing theory, right?
We're going to be talking, there's going to be a little bit of it. So we have 3 50-minute meetings, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then a lab period on Friday. And the lab period is strictly going to be time for you to make games. And there may be some time for that throughout the week as well. But my background is in reinforcement learning, so I want to talk a good bit about introducing how to make intelligent agents in games. So that will be the main topic that we talk about for a chunk of the class. But as there is interest, I may have time to design some extra material if we finish that. Or I am also planning to use some of those days to just continue to let people work on their games. During those lab periods, I will be meeting with each group. Basically, everyone will be working in the lab, and I'll find an open classroom. And you'll come in and just talk about the progress that you've made over the last week. I'll give you some feedback or some ideas. I'll help you brainstorm how should you move forward from here? What are some ideas of what you could do? What have you overscoped? How should you prototype this and make it so that what you have is a reasonable product at the end of this period. You don't have a half completed game with a bunch of great ideas that never made it into the final product. So you will be meeting with me at least once a week to get some feedback on what you've been doing, where you're going.
Kind of similar to 350.
Yeah. Similar to 350, except that my plan is to, yeah, I won't necessarily have as much time on a group by group basis, since if there are, how many were there enrolled? Something like 24, I think, enrolled. That would mean 8 groups of 3. So maybe it is fairly similar to the last 350 that I taught, since there were 7 groups there. So you'll have something like 10 to 15 minutes of interaction time. But that's again why I want there to be some of the time over the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday lecture part where we're doing that as well. So maybe an average of 1 day a week, there's extra work time on games because I want them to be as good as possible. Other questions on kind of transitioning from one class to the next? We'll have more time as we start the next quarter, but I want to ground people on what is the long-term plan of the 2-course sequence, because I think that's also necessary as we get close to course evaluation time. It's useful to see what we've done in the grander scope of what is planned rather than just treating this class as a standalone, because it has been too theoretical for a standalone class. But it's not a standalone class. Yeah.
The recommendation for anything to do over break, if we're not planning on resting.
Practice, go to a game jam. If not, find some people in class and try to make a small game jam. Can you make something real quick over a few days, or just to get experience with trying to come up with a final product? And then in a short, limited period of time. It doesn't have to be particularly fun or great or work, but just any experience that you get from that will be useful and beneficial going into the time crunch that we'll be putting together your first game next quarter. But there are also community-driven game jams, so searching for and participating in those, doing some kind of passion project in Unity, just starting what is something interesting that you could do. Make a fun physics puzzle in Unity. That's not necessarily a game, but maybe it's something that is like a series of dominoes falling over, or try to get a sense of the physics of some of these systems so that you can design something interesting next quarter with that in mind. I don't know, random ideas, but play around. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
It makes sense to find groups before the quarter ends.
You can. Just note that you won't be able to work with any of the same people from your group the first time when you make your second game. So you're not working with people, the same people the entire quarter. You'll be working with 2 other people for the first game and then 2 completely other people for the second game. And then you also may not work with the 1 other graduate student who will be in the class on the first game, because I'm going to force you 2 to be together on the second game. And 1 other highly inspired and aspiring undergraduate who wants to join you, since I think there's only going to be 2 graduates in the class. So think about if you want to be that undergraduate. Do you want to be the person who's working with graduate students and has graduate level expectations placed on you, but then you're also working with graduate students? There's some opportunity there, and also, you'll get pushed a bit more. They have some good support. We have 2 phenomenal graduate students in this class. Anything else before we get back to combat? All right, last time we were just starting to talk about combat. I asked people the best combat experiences they've had in a video game and to try to summarize those quickly or easily. We then motivated the fact that the combat experience is not particularly mathematical. You don't think about it in terms of a lot of math when you're in the middle of combat, but the math is the system that is underlying the combat in the first place. So from a designer's perspective, you need to be thinking about combat as what are the underlying numbers that create the feeling that you enjoy when you're piloting a character engaged in combat. So it is math underneath the hood. So players can feel when combat is well designed. It's a feeling. It can feel fluid. It can feel responsive. It can feel impactful. What are some other words that you would use to describe good feeling combat?
Satisfying, did you say satisfying?
Satisfying? Yeah.
So like weighty.
What was that?
Weighty, like the.
Oh, weighty. Yeah. Yeah. It's impactful. I think it's similar to that concept of when you hit something, you feel like you hit something. When you slice something, you feel like you've sliced something. It's not just you didn't take the sharp edge of a sword and it went and bounced off of something. It really feels like you are taking the role of the element engaged in that combat. So thinking mathematically, it's not anywhere near enough to make someone enjoy combat. Players should feel empowered in some nature, some way, capable of making winning decisions, would be that at a larger scale strategically in combat or at the low level in the actual mano-a-mano combat. They should feel heroically badass, at least occasionally. When they make good decisions, they should feel like those decisions were rewarded. And so combat can be way too large of a space. There are too many options in a design space. So to help ground designers in designing combat, we need to think of combat as some kind of repeatable loop, some kind of repeatable process. So some repeatable sequence of actions, and we can utilize the actions in that sequence to take data about the current positions of elements of the combat system. An entire game could just be a 30-second combat loop in varied environments with different weapons against enemies who use different skills. An entire game can be made around that. And instead of trying to balance the entire game, you're now looking at this 30-second loop and repeating this 30-second loop some number of times. So think of it kind of like a 2D array, where we focus in on the 30 seconds and making the 30 seconds as cool as possible. So to get this feeling fluid, we need some elements. The first is the position of the camera. So where is the camera during combat? Where is the camera looking? Is the camera looking at the player character? Is it third person? Is it looking from the character's perspective in first person? As you're looking around you, is your character moving along with the camera? Or is the camera rotating around your character? These kinds of design decisions will certainly affect how combat feels from a control perspective. How is the camera moving? Is it able to move when your character moves, independent from your character or a group of characters? Can the player get the information they need from the camera's positioning in all of the different combat situations they may find themselves in? So if you're being attacked from behind and your camera is facing forward, how fast or how quickly can you determine where that is coming from, whether it is worth turning your character around and engaging something else when you have that moment of panic? How fluid is it to put yourself in a position to engage with the information that you just received? So, of course, this depends on the game's perspective. It can be third person. If it's third person, you can utilize a lock-on mechanic. And that way you don't have to find the source of what's attacking you. You use the lock-on button and it will immediately lock your perspective on who is attacking you, which can allow you to strafe, it can allow you to dodge roll, it can allow whatever else in the game is used for movement. Now you're immediately facing that direction and can engage with it in short order. That feels fluid, that feels responsive. Like the game, when you are tapped on the shoulder, you're immediately looking in that direction. If you want your game to feel fluid and reactive, you want to be able to very quickly, when you are startled, position your character to the point of interest. First-person games will utilize environmental effects. So things like lens effects. If your character gets staggered or an explosion goes off near them or something of the effect, then you can start to feel what your character feels through the lens of the camera. This can be things like motion blurring as well, makes you feel like you're moving faster. Shaking, if you are taking a hit of some kind, then it feels realistic if the camera moves in a way that the human's body would if you're in control of a human. Things like crosshairs can be useful to determine where is it that you are currently aiming. Any other visual cues? If something is attacking you from the right, there could be a screen notification that says, something happened to your right, turn right. The entire idea behind the design of a camera is that the player should not know that the camera is there. It's invisible and implemented well. You should feel like you are in control of the character, not in control of the camera looking at the character. And that is a huge distinction and difference when it comes to controls. The combat can't be good if the camera isn't good. Regardless of every other good decision that you make, if it's frustrating to control or frustrating to try to manipulate, doesn't matter. The rest of it doesn't matter at all. So think about the camera from the user's perspective as you're designing how the camera moves. That's a significant part of combat design. For sound, sound sets the mood, very much so. It fills the intermediary space between the game's code, the art, and the player's imagination. As you're designing sound, think about the following. The sounds you use should be crisp and high quality. You don't want muted sounds if you're trying to create a high intensity atmosphere. You also don't want players confusing similar sounds. So if sounds represent different things, the player should be able to determine what is happening based on the sound. You should know which weapon was fired by the NPC that's behind you. They shouldn't all sound the same unless you are the one controlling it. Then you can't make as informed of a tactical decision. Think about the level of danger that each sound represents to the player, and you can dynamically scale the volume of the sounds that are playing at the same time based on the level of danger to the player's character. If the player's character is being fired at, and there are allies that are firing next to you, tune down the allies, tune up the one that's fired at you, so you can start to hear where that's coming from. If you can identify where it's coming from, then the player feels like they were able to identify the enemy unit. If it's played just at its default level because your allies are so much closer to you, then it feels like the game is unfair. The player doesn't feel like the badass that they want to be. I picked out where that enemy was based on that sound. That's a good feeling to a player. So dynamic volume is good in this case. It's very easy to overlook good audio, and it's difficult to notice, but you certainly notice when it's not there. So it doesn't get quite as much credit as it deserves when it is truly thought through. But it's what really separates a good game from a great game in terms of its combat. Especially if it's real time, it requires reactions. Sound can be a big difference maker. Also very well used transitioning to and from combat situations. You can be alerted to moving from a passive way of thinking. I'm passively thinking about moving from point A to point B. I've engaged in combat. What pulls you, what kinds of sounds pull you into immediate attention? So if the player character draws their weapon, that's a good way of doing that. But you need something that usually is both visual and audio as a way to tell the player, change the way that you're thinking, the game has changed around you. If you have a battle over screen with celebratory music, that's a way of letting the player know in some capacity how they did. My favorite games have different end of battle music based on how the battle went. If you barely survived that battle, there is a difference. Say, all right, you need to heal now. There's danger to your party because of the damage that you took from that last fight. Versus if you slaughtered the enemy, then it's very celebratory. Like, you did great. Your party's in excellent shape. Morale is high. You can kind of get the sense of the morale of the characters around you based on the audio that is playing, and making that dynamic to the events that are happening around you really set the mood and can make any narrative elements carry more weight. So yeah, customize the sound and effects to the story situation. If a character in your party is dying around you, don't have happy music playing unless you really hate that character. That would certainly be funny. How do you design weapons? How do you design the sound of weapons, the look and feel of weapons, so that when you do get into combat, those weapons feel good to use? There should be visual feedback from the character and weapon motion. It should feel like it's actually happening. Heavy weapons should feel more badass when they connect with something. It should feel heavy when it hits. It should feel heavy to lift back up in preparation for the next. It feels like you're actually using that weapon if it feels heavy. If you're carrying a large gun, it should restrict your movement a little bit, as opposed to a small, lighter gun that does not do so much and allows you to be more nimble. If a weapon has some best qualities, you can over-exaggerate them, and that helps the player in terms of understanding why they selected it, or to feel good about why they selected it. I selected the big, heavy two-handed sword because I want large impacts. I want a far reach with my weapon. If you over-exaggerate that a bit, I mean, don't necessarily go as far as Cloud's sword, but having something that is large and impactful makes the player feel good about the decisions that they made. Think about where weapons collide with things. So can you add particle effects to the impact in ways that make it look like it was a large collision? Rather than just having something bounce off, can you cause some sparks? Can you throw some particles of it colliding with armor? These are now pieces of metal bouncing off of this, sparks off of this. So also do make sure they play quickly. It's better to have immediate feedback that feels harsh and then is gone, and then the player's attention is elsewhere. They shouldn't be drawn to the particle effects because they linger, unless, of course, this is in slow motion of some kind. But what does the impact leave behind? If you swing a large two-handed sword or a large two-handed mallet and you hit the ground, it should leave an indent of some kind. Again, reinforce that the player took a large, heavy weapon with, it doesn't have to be permanent change to the terrain, but even a temporary change to something makes the player feel like they affected the world around them by the decisions that they made. Differentiate a hit from a miss. You don't play the same animation or the same sounds if a weapon collides with something or misses something. There should be something in the design that makes the hit feel good. This makes sense. But the player should know, either just based off sound, based off of something about how it feels, whether something was a hit or a miss. They shouldn't have to look at a health bar to determine whether they hit or missed with something. They should get that visceral feedback from a hit, or feel something stumbling, or a big loud whoosh from a miss. Do note, what's another difficult thing to take into account here is that server calculations can affect a lot of this. And any lag or delay between server calculations and the feel of that from the client's perspective, that adds tons of lag to games. And that starts to really feel bad, even with tiny amounts of delay. So as the server is calculating something, add something on the client side so that it still feels natural. Does that make sense? So when you're designing a game, the server side is doing the math, because if the client side is doing the math, then that's a file that can be edited. And you don't want your players having control of the game's code. You don't want to be able to change the damage of a sword in a multiplayer game from the client side. So the server has to be doing damage calculations, hit calculations. But if you have 100 millisecond ping between that and the server, there's 100 milliseconds there and back, a tenth of a second, waiting for, did this hit or not? So between you're either doing predictive movement of this is going to intersect with this enemy, send the hit calculation so that by the time the sword gets through the air to the armor, we know whether it's going to be a hit or a miss. Or you wait for the animation of whether it was a hit or a miss 100 milliseconds after you detect the collision. And then you have a tenth of a second delay for any sound effect that plays because the server has to return whether that was a hit or a miss. So you're gonna have to use a lot of network and predictive logic in order to have the results when you need them on the client side. But you can also split the logic between the server side and the client side such that some animation starts playing on the client side and maybe that gets canceled based on a server side calculation. Or something can still feel on time and visceral as long as you're thinking about the communication between the client side and the server side. So any client server disagreements should be hidden. The player should not be aware of them and resolve them without the player being aware that they occurred. This makes sense. But that is a lot of game design on the server side. Yeah.
What do you mean by client server disagreements?
So when we say that add client side calculations, the client may determine it's likely to be a hit, and the server returns it was a miss.
Oh, okay.
So when there's that kind of disagreement of the client side is preparing for the hit, the server side says, it's a miss, abort. The player should not be aware that that disagreement occurred. You should have some way of determining and resolving that in the fluidity of combat in a way that the player is not aware of that. All of that is hidden behind the visual layer, the audio layer that the player actually experiences. There are many ways to actually go do that, but it's something that you certainly need to consider. Clarity, another huge issue with many games, and especially novice games. So combat is when clarity is most important. This just means that decisions have the most weight, have the most immediate weight in a combat situation. When you decide to do something, you're going to see immediate results from that decision. So you want to be informed when you're making those decisions. So your UI should be designed from the ground up for the most tense situation that you'll run into. As an example, or just in general, can the player find all of the information that they're going to need without distracting themselves from the action? They shouldn't need to think about, I'm going from looking at the action to looking at the UI, to looking at the action, to looking at the UI, to looking at the action. The UI should be set up in such a way that all of the relevant information is part of the screen. It's something that's on your peripheral if it's important. So thinking action RPGs, your health globe is visible from your peripheral. You know when you've taken health damage because something feels wrong about your line of sight. Another example, crap, what's it called? Dead Space. I thought that was very nice to have Isaac's health bar on the back of his suit so that you didn't need any UI and it felt very realistic to be on board a spaceship with no UI. The UI was built into the game objects that were moving around in the game's space. It really added to the feel, to the atmosphere of the game. Really cool design decision for its time, at least. So think about where is the relevant information. Don't distract from the action of an action-oriented game by having the player go look at a UI. That said, for strategy games where the game is maybe paused, or you can pause the game to make informed decisions, then it's more okay to hide more information in complex UIs so that you can take in all the information that you need to make a complex decision based on many input variables. But for action games, you shouldn't be making complex decisions based on a ton of a bunch of variables that are hidden and not available directly on the screen. So, how many enemies are there? Where are they? That's on the screen. But how much of this particular resource do I have? A UI element for a first-person shooter. How many shots do I have until my magazine is empty? How many times can I reload before I'm out of bullets? All of those are usually UI elements you have to go look at and make a calculation about that might affect your immediate strategy. If that can be embedded somewhere in the UI where you don't have to go hunt for it, find it, think about it, go back to the UI of playing the game, that's distracting. So build those kinds of things into the UI where you can. Think about it from the tensest situation. So things like the health values of yourself, your allies, your enemies, locations of self, allies, and enemies. Are you using a mini-map? Is the mini-map overlaid on top of the map? Do you have options for where that is displayed? Do you even have a mini-map in your game? Are you relying on the action to tell the player where their allies are, where their enemies are? Can you make informed decisions about the game based on what is available in the UI? Is the UI in the way? Do you have to refer to the UI? How frequently to make important decisions? So knowledge of surroundings, is that embedded in the UI? Who is attacking? Where are they with respect to you? These are all things that can be put into a UI, can be hidden from a UI. And of course, it's based on the game, the feeling that you want to evoke by having someone play the game. For clarity, what can you do? Think about the following kinds of questions. Can the enemy movement and attack patterns be simplified without the loss of strategy? If they're doing something that's very complicated, can we simplify what they are doing without making them trivial? When a player is confused about a UI element, is it, or a game situation, is it due to the strategy that they're proposing or using, or is it an information clarity problem? Do they not know how to make an informed decision or a relevant strategy because they don't have information that they would need to make that decision? When a player fails, do they know what killed them? Do they know why they died? These are all kinds of playtesting questions that you can ask as well. So have someone who is playtesting recap why they lost, and then dig into your data and look at whether the player accurately could recap what happened and why they failed. If they cannot do that, there is an information clarity problem. You can add death recaps, something where you can watch from a different perspective. You can watch from the enemy's perspective as they killed your character. You can watch from your character's perspective and be able to move the camera. You may get a textual recap of what damage type it was, how much damage you took. But then also think about how much information is on the screen. Did they die because there was so much information on the screen that they were trying to process that they couldn't focus on what they needed to focus on to be successful at the game? So things like an overcluttered UI, was that the reason that the character died? Were there too many flashy effects happening simultaneously that they couldn't determine the terrain that was around them. They couldn't differentiate their own flashy attack from something that was dangerous. A big slam from a boss. They couldn't see that coming because their skills had so many particle effects emanating from them that they couldn't distinguish between the particle effects that were their own damage and a preparation for a dangerous enemy attack. Questions on anything so far? Another important aspect of combat is timing, which it's not really its own separate category. It's really a subcategory of clarity. But thinking from a perspective of timing, when you create danger for your players, do they have time to sense that danger and react to that danger? Do they have the time to formulate a strategy to avoid that danger from coming to pass? The answer is yes. Great. The player can feel powerful that they are able to evade danger, but if not, then you may have a clarity issue. You may have a timing issue in that the attacks are happening so fast, the player doesn't know what they can do. It may be a control problem. They don't know what to do to dodge the attack or to prepare to block the attack. When should the game be challenging the player? Do we want them to always be on edge, always be prepared for dodging something, blocking something? Or do we want that to be relegated to most boss encounters? How long do we give the player to recoup before throwing the next challenge at them? Is there some underlying logic that says if the player just dodged, don't throw something that forces them to dodge again for at least some amount of time past the recovery of the dodge? That is something that you could put into a game. Maybe you don't want to. And that way the player's strategy is don't get yourself surrounded to the point where you have so many enemies around you that a dodge isn't going to successfully avoid danger. Once a player makes a decision, they don't want to wait for the game to react to their decision. They want the game to continue to be fluid around the decisions that they are making. Otherwise, they feel too much like the protagonist. Like the game exists just to provide the challenge to the player. It's not a real battle. Think of the timing of Western versus South Korean StarCraft. The game is optimized differently, just in general, to account for the demographic who is playing it. It's actually different code, which is interesting. Yeah, so in StarCraft, Koreans are so good in general that if you have a base level of difficulty for this, none of them would ever be challenged in any capacity. So the AI for South Korean StarCraft is much faster and much more potent with challenge. Here's the next one. Here's the next one. You should be recovering your defenses while you're engaging in war. Whereas a typical real-time strategy will alternate between allowing the player to recover and then sending the next wave of troops at them that they need to defend, so that the player isn't trying to focus on two things at once. But Korean StarCraft is very much, you should be focusing on every single aspect of the game at the same time. Even when war is happening, you're not sitting there watching the war unfold. You are directing your troops, giving them something to do, planning the backups being made for the next thing, going back to this, checking on it, making changes as needed, researching a new technology so that by the time that technology researches, that will be what changes the course of this battle. As the units are being produced, that new wave of troops that go in are going to be able to better deal with the threat that's on hand. This threat is just keeping them from our important resources. All of that is happening in real time at the high level, and that is not an introductory way to play the game. So it's actually designed for the different audiences that would engage with the game. So some pillars of combat. First one should be the genre. Before you're too deep in designing your combat, you should know what your game genre is going to be. And from there, you should know what mechanics are going to be necessary by players' expectations of a game in that genre. You're making a fighting game. Players are going to have some expectations about how a fighting game is handled. What mechanics will you change to differentiate your game from others in that genre? You don't just want to clone an existing game, you want to improve on something or differentiate something so that players have a reason to play your game over an existing game. What else in your game needs to change in order to support your other changes? You can't just make a change in a vacuum. It's going to have an effect on systems that are around it, which has effects on systems that are around those. There's the timing of your combat. So is your combat real-time, turn-based, some hybrid of those? How does the combat approach differ between a real-time and turn-based version of this particular game that you're designing? If you're designing a strategy game, what's the difference between a real-time strategy game and a turn-based strategy game? Why would you design one to be real-time and one to be turn-based? Real-time focuses more on the action and real-time decisions. One focuses more on the strategy behind those decisions and optimizing those decisions, taking the time that you need to make the right decisions, as opposed to time being a factor in those decisions. You need to make decisions fast enough that the results are seen, but they need to be good enough decisions that you can still win the game. So very different approaches to the same genre of game. It's just the time of the combat. The pacing of the combat, kind of a scale of intensity. Is it methodical and calculated? Or is it intense? Is it action-oriented? How does your combat feel? As you're designing this combat system, you will want to find descriptive words for how you want your players to feel while they're engaging with your combat. As you start to design your combat, you can go back to these words that you want your players to feel as they're engaging with your combat and look at the systems that you are designing and map those systems onto what you're trying to evoke from your players. Are you trying to make them scared? Are you trying to make them calculating? Are you trying to make them hopeful? Who are the participants in your combat? So how many and what type? Is your game player versus player, player versus environment, single player, multiplayer, team play, solo? Do you have AI teammates, AI enemies? Just knowing who the participants of the combat are and how you want to design for the feelings that you want to evoke, given who the participants are going to be. We have the progression. So how does the player progress through combat? So to what extent, and what is the rate of the player's skill growth? How fast are they getting better at the combat systems in your game? That determines a lot with regards to how you're going to structure the rest of your game. There's the character progression. So rate of the player character's power growth. How quickly are they leveling? How much changes on each level? How much stronger are they getting? I can ask this question. Maybe the class has an opinion on this. How does combat design change based on the extent to which you want to prioritize player progression versus character progression? Does that question make sense? Kind of. So you can think of an incremental game that basically plays itself. The decisions that you make are the extent to which number go up faster. There's not a ton of skill involved in that. It's just a matter of the game almost plays itself. That's one far end of the spectrum. In fact, the very first incremental game was what, Progress Quest back in the 90s. I think it was like 96, something like that. Game that completely plays itself. You download it, you start it, and you watch it play itself. It's just a bunch of progress bars that fill up. You gain skills, you gain levels, and there is no interaction whatsoever. This is fully focusing on character progression. There is no player progression at all. On the other hand, a roguelike, a pure roguelike, is player progression without much character progression. Where if you want to do better at this game, it's going to be because you got better at the game, not because your character got stronger. This could also be a platformer. Your character doesn't get stronger throughout the platformer. You just get more skilled at evading the traps that are thrown your way, the enemies that are thrown your way. Yeah.
Well, like, would you consider like a tack shooter, like CSGO? Because there isn't really much like character progression.
Yeah.
It's basically just
very
skill is
yeah. Yeah. Skill wins. So how are these games designed differently? How does your design for combat change depending on whether you want to prioritize skill growth or numerical growth? Yeah.
Maybe this is simplifying it too much, but at least with the examples you gave, I feel like with the games that prioritize the player skill growth, the combat is a lot simpler. Where the games that prioritize the character growth, they can be a lot more going on. Like I just looked up Progress Quest and like other idle games,
Yeah.
or like platformers. They're very, or not. I guess that would be the other side, but like they're very confusing in like all the information. But you don't need to be like that good to understand it. Like a game like CS:GO, like
Yeah.
platformer, it's very simple, but in the simplicity, that's where the skill rails.
Yeah.
Like that's where
Yeah. If you're designing combat for skill, player skill, it's going to be that you need some difficulty that can be overcome by knowledge and experience. If you're looking for more character progression, the overcoming the difficulty is through decisions that you make about powers that you get your character. So eventually you can overcome any obstacle if you can continue to gain that character progression in some capacity. So you can design very differently I find it more difficult to design for player progression, personally, because how do you know that what you've designed is difficult early on, becomes easier and more possible as you get more skilled? There's a very delicate balance there between everyone's able to complete it on the first try, and even as you get good at the systems, you can't complete it. That balance is very delicate. Whereas it's much easier to map math to character progression because you have an anticipated path through the outcomes. And even if there are variations to that, that is something that isn't necessarily felt by the player. If they are too powerful for the existing content, they blast through it and get to the next content that is more difficult. And it balances the difficulty in that regard. If it's too difficult for them, they can farm for a bit, redo some content, get an upgrade or two, level up, and now it is possible. So it doesn't have to be quite as perfectly balanced in order for the player to feel like they have a path through the content. If you're designing for player progression, you need difficulty levels or something of the sort so that players aren't dying to the same thing over and over and over and over again. Some people have the patience for that. I am not one of them. But it's worth considering. All right, we're out of time already. So we'll come back to this tomorrow and probably finish everything off. So I think we have just about 1 day's worth of content. And again, starting next week, make sure to bring your best attempt at a balanced deck. And we can start getting some play testing. If you aren't quite at that point yet, then you can volunteer your time to help someone who is more prepared to collect data and hopefully agree with them that they can help you once your decks are ready. So we just need enough people to have some idea of what that balance is going to be so that we can get some experience on Monday. See you tomorrow for that.
Yeah.